On my video about gunplay, a comment was left about how you get the feel of both movement and combat right in an FPS. And while we've spoken many times about gunplay and the action side of that, we haven't really done a video yet discussing more about the finer points of movement. Not only making a game feel great for fast characters, but also giving weight to the actions as well. Movement in video games is very similar to UI design, in that there aren't a lot of really good studies or discussions about it. They're one of those things that when it works, nobody ever really talks about it, and when it doesn't work, everyone can't stop talking about it. But movement, similar to jumping, or is one of those actions that it seems second nature. It's as common as breathing. But the difference between good and bad in terms of that feel of motion definitely deserves study. And I'm sure there's a lot of smaller topics we could bring up. And if anyone has any movement related topics or questions, let me know in the comments below and we may turn that into another video. But when we talk about movement in video games, we're going to break things down into more of the fast or arcade side and kind of the slow and deliberate side. And we'll start with fast because that is what a lot of people will assume when we talk about motion and movement in games. Be it in the 2D space with Super Meat Boy, Mario, the wealth of indie-based titles, or when we go first-person arcadey with stuff like Doom, Quake, and many other kinds of titles. But when it comes to movement, be it fast or slow, one of the major points is that it has to be as one-to-one with the motion of the controller as it can be. So what that means is that if I'm taking my lovely little gamepad here and I flick in a direction, that character should at least immediately move or respond to that. You do not want any kinds of delays or unintentional delays with the motion and the animation. There are unusual exceptions with the idea of adventure platforming. Games like Out of This World, not Alone in the Dark, Another World, which I think are just the same games there, Flashback, Prince of Persia, and you get the picture, where the character is explicitly designed not to be high speed. But whenever I push a button, that character will immediately begin his animation. You do not want any kinds of delays when the character is moving. Because when the player, in any kind of movement-based title, the player is always trying to extrapolate where they're trying to go and where they're starting from. And if they have to take that additional step of, okay, I need to assume my character is not going to respond for a quarter of a second, that's going to make things harder and unintentionally more frustrating to play. Now, when it comes to high-speed movement, the player, you have to be really careful about just how fast things can be. In Doom over there, even though the Doom Marine moves very quickly, and again, it's more on the arcade side, it's still responsive. The player never loses control of the Doom Marine. He moves when the player moves. There's a tendency in a lot of smaller titles, especially those that use physics to kind of define the motion, that the character will keep moving even when the player is not controlling them. I've seen this a lot in indie platformers, where when the character jumps, even if I let go of the control stick, the physics or the force will still push that character forward. And you would think that would be helpful, but the problem is that if the player is not 100% in control of the character, it starts to feel very clumsy or very frustrating to control that character. Again, one of the great examples of high-speed movement would be something like Super Meat Boy, that despite the fact that the player has to make micro adjustments in the air, it's all kept relatively fair by the fact that it is pretty much one-to-one of gamepad interaction to character motion. And no matter how you want to design your character, you want that fidelity to be as close as possible. Now, when you're designing multiple actions or mechanics for the player to do while they're in motion, as we've said before when we talked about the idea of primary versus secondary actions, every primary action should get its own unique button or control or a key press. You don't want the player to accidentally hit the wrong button or want the wrong motion to carry over. In Super Mario World, for instance, the spin jump and the normal jump are both delegated or relegated to different buttons. Imagine if they were both on the same button and it was more of a context sensitive thing. It would be very clumsy to control, and you know players would hit the wrong action or the wrong thing would go off at the wrong time. There's also where you see that ever popular issue of the use button is the same as the jump button, so every time you try to interact with a switch or a door, your character jumps instead of open that door up. But we're going to take our quick Patreon supporter and sponsor break now, and when we come back, we're going to approach things from the other end of the spectrum, and that is what happens when you're trying to deal with combat that's on the slower, more methodical side, and can it still be responsive when you're not moving around like a bat out of hell, like that picture in the corner. And now for a quick thank you to our current Game Wisdom sponsors and Patreon supporters. And if you'd like to continue the discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. When it comes to talking about making great movement, but focusing more on the deliberate or slower side of things, the Souls-like franchise, or just Souls-like in general, have been some of the standout examples of this. As anyone who's played, whether it's Dark Souls, Bloodborne, or any other number of these kinds of games knows, you cannot be button mashing. Combat, despite the fact that I am trying to dodge roll and dodge around like a pro here, is still kept very deliberate. It's very methodical. Part of the reason for this is, of course, the ever-famous stamina bar that you see in the top left. But even without that, the Souls series does a great job of not only giving good motion, but also providing weight to your actions. And it doesn't feel, or at least it eventually gets to a point that it doesn't feel clunky or hard to control in the player's hands. And there are several things to understand about what they do. The first is that, like we said, this is not a game about button mashing. Everything is essentially tied to the animation of the character and the animations of the attacks and defenses and so on. This is very important because the game itself features buffering. And what that means is that if I'm performing an action, and then while the animation is playing out, I hit another button, the game will assume that I want to perform that action the second the animation is done. So if, let's say, I go to dodge, and then while I'm in the middle of the dodge, I hit the button to drink my Estus, the game will assume that the second I'm done with that, I should drink the Estus. And this is very important because this has tripped up players before thinking that they can just button mash their way through. Another big point is that as we're moving around, some things can be canceled, or some animations can be canceled, but not everything. When I'm swinging my weapon, for instance, I need to wait for that attack animation to finish before I can dodge. Now, if I dodge immediately, as soon as the animation starts, I can sometimes cancel it. But it's not a case where I can perfectly dodge cancel anytime I want. And this is something that is dependent on the design of the game, and we usually see this more in 100% action-focused titles, such as Devil May Cry, Ninja Gaiden, and so on. Now, with the Souls-likes here, again, while we are moving kind of fast, this is still, like, compared to other action-based titles, like a glacier in terms of movement. Now, one thing that you're not going to see in this part that I want to bring up is the use of heavy weapons. We're talking, massive two-handed axes, the Buster Sword, you name it. When you have games that feature incredibly slow-moving weapons like that, it's always about the animation and the impact that kind of give it that good sense of motion. So that when my character is swinging a two-handed axe, that should not be the same kind of motion or heft as if I'm swinging a dagger, and vice versa. Now, with that said, there's one thing that we haven't touched on yet that I don't think a lot of people discuss that's very important for when you're doing motion in games. And that is, how does the world around the player kind of respond or behave to the player's speed? What I mean is that if you're trying to make a game that's very methodical, very slow pace, you need to be careful how fast enemies respond and behave. If every enemy is high speed and all my weapons and all my animations are slow, then unless you give something to compensate for that, such as being able to stagger enemies or knock them out of animations, that player is not going to be able to do well in that world. Now, if I am super high speed, like let's say I'm playing Sekiro or Super Meat Boy analog, and everything around me is super slow, then that's going to become very easy to the point that there's not going to be any real reason to play. And you need to understand, again, just how the timings for everything work. The faster the player is, you can make the enemies faster to compensate. But you need to be careful how you design obstacles and situations based on the motion at work. In something like Super Meat Boy, for instance, many of those obstacles require, again, split-second micro-adjustments and trying to basically adapt on the fly. And it works because the character of Meat Boy is so agile and so responsive. You couldn't do the same thing in Super Meat Boy as you could do in something like Prince of Persia or Another World, because the character's motion in that design just aren't built to compensate. And again, as we said at the start, motion and movement in games is a topic that we don't really hear a lot about because, again, it becomes a lot like second nature. That once you get used to it, it shouldn't really matter. But it's very easy to screw this up, especially with very tightly designed games, such as the Souls-like formula here, if everything is not working right. This is one of those things that I think kind of screwed me when I was trying to play the Surge and the Surge 2. That it felt like either I was too fast and the enemies were too slow, or I was too slow and the enemies were too fast, based on how I was using my weapons and how things were working. And there's a greater discussion to be had about that we don't have the time to for today. But to wrap things up for now, motion, whether it's high speed or very deliberate, is all about how much fidelity there is in the movement, the controls, and the animation. No matter how you want to build your game, you should always strive for one-to-one in terms of player control to what's happening on screen. Especially if this is an action-based game. Again, we're talking about strategy titles, turn-based RPGs, RTS. That is a completely different story there. But you need to be aware that however you design your character, the world around them has to reflect that. This is why when we play a game like Doom or Dusk or Quake, that everything moves at a high speed because the player is designed to move around at that high speed. You aren't supposed to be moving slowly in Dusk or Doom. Now, if we were playing a shooter such as The Division or Gears of War or those types of games that are focused more on cover-based shooting and being more methodical, then that is a different story. And again, however you want the character or the player to behave, you have to balance that around the world. So, with that said, obviously my question for those of you watching this, can you think of games that did a great job of making the character feel right in the player's hands? And we'll break things down to both high speed and deliberate games. And can you think of titles where it didn't work well? That it feels like almost like two distinct different timings. You know, the one that the player is using and the one that's the world or the enemies are using. Let me know in the comments below, but thanks for watching this video. As always, if you'd like to suggest a topic for a future piece, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where is in the art and science of games. Until next time, take care. If you're looking for more wisdom about game design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books, 20 Essential Games to Study, aimed for first-time developers and students looking for some inspiration for their upcoming games, and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers if you're interested in anything regarding 2D and 3D platforming design. They're both available in print, digital, and wherever books are being sold. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.